Thank both speakers. We have dessert waiting for you, but before the dessert, we figured that we'd have a few moments to take questions or comments that anyone in the audience might have. Teresa is doing this on behalf of David, so she might not be able to speak for David, but perhaps she would be available for some questions too. Questions or comments? Sir. Yeah.
Hello? Yes, I have a question to our first speaker. I believe there's a long history of people having parts of their brains removed surgically and a study of what they did afterwards. Could you comment on that?
Yes. In one case, half the brain was removed, and the child grew up and is well, behaving normally. But that was 50% of the brain. And Lorber's cases, he reckons about 95% of the brain is gone. So, yes, we always amaze with this, and we always give the same explanation, plasticity, whatever that means. And I call it a comfort word. Scientists love comfort words. One of their comfort words at present is junk DNA. You know, DNA, we can forget about it because it's junk, you know, and it's obviously junk. Everyone understands that. But in fact, now we're finding out that, in fact, it's not quite so junky as we had thought at the start.
I think a really wonderful case of that is Beethoven. The medical doctors have inferred by his deafness and various and sundry things that they think like about 60-70% of his brain was a brain tumor when he wrote the Ninth Symphony. Because, I mean, he was deaf by the time he wrote the Fifth Symphony, and looking at the progression of the tumor, so he had more brain tumor than brain when he wrote the greatest of his musical treatises, which is pretty awesome. And the last thing, I love this, the last thing that Beethoven did on his deathbed was to put up his fist as his last gesture toward the great, taking him out, so to speak, which is pretty awesome.
I have a good friend and neighbor who discovered his own brain tumor because he was unable to do Sudokus anymore. I'd like you to explain that perhaps, but I have another comment. In order to bring together the two speeches which we've just heard, I'd like to bring together poetry and the cloud. Something in poetry causes pressures and messages to come to the future from past poets. For example, the poem Christabel by Coleridge, he never finished, but because of the pressure of how well the poem was written, Coleridge's desire to have it finished has been accomplished by at least 11 other people, which impressed me as a way of Coleridge sending something to the cloud, which was then received by all these others who eventually finished the work.
An interesting hypothesis, but I'm a scientist and I would like some evidence.
Well, there is the evidence that 11 people have done that work. Whether it came through the pressure of what is in the poem itself is to be sort of discussed. Because then if you go back and say, whatever was written at the time caused the future mind to do something else is probably more important. And if one looks deeply into wherever one tries to find the cloud, it probably has this kind of evidence behind it.
Unfortunately, what I got from this talk is that we don't know very much about the brain. Am I wrong to draw that conclusion? And if I in any way am correct, then where does that leave us?
Well, yes, you are. You are entitled to draw that. This is what some books are saying. It's part of the scientific process that we have to get money for our research, and we tend to oversell what we're doing and try and pretend that we know the answers sooner than we have, and that one particular trail will be more productive than another. And scientists are competing with each other, and sometimes this sort of thing happens. It's very sad because, as Romanes found out, he in fact was independently wealthy, which is one of the reasons why he got on so well with Darwin, who were both independently wealthy. And he found out that after Darwin had died, he came up with a view of Darwin's work, which actually literally turned Darwinism on its head. It's a very simple idea. First, Darwin said, first you have natural selection, then you get a new species. And Romanes said, no. First you get changes which cause the new species to occur, and then you get natural selection. So it turned it completely upside down. And everyone said, this is an attack on Darwin. He's questioning Darwin. Darwin was the truth. They had decided that Darwin had arrived at the truth. We had no longer need to worry about evolution. Darwin had solved it all. And here was this young whippersnapper, this Canadian, coming along and telling us that Darwin was wrong. And everyone, and this is evident in their published writings, Thomas Huxley turned on Darwin, on Romanes, and in his texts, in various texts you can read through the lines, he's indirectly referring to Romanes. And if he would put these things in writing, what he said behind Romanes' back, we don't know, but perhaps the whole of the scientific community were turned against Romanes. And he died, if you read Ethel's biography, just tells this very nicely, very sadly, how he turned to one scientist and another scientist and look, read it, can't you see? And he was just amazed that they couldn't see what he was saying. So we have an enormous amount to learn about the brain. And one of the reasons that slowing down brain research is that marketing plays such a big role in it.
You mentioned Carl Herber and David Bowman knew both. Frickum's argument was that the brain stores information like a hologram versus like a picture. Bowman's argument was that the universe is ontologically Hilbert's.
Could you say that a bit louder?
Bowman's argument was that the universe is ontologically
Hilbert
Hilbert's.
space.
What's the relation?
I have no idea. I'm not a physicist. What? Yeah, and I preceded this, but I am not able to explain it. If I can put you in contact with Berkovich, who is guided by these people, and this is one line of evidence. I'm trying to follow the evidence, and this is one line of evidence which seems to be pointing towards a general conclusion that there's mind in the universe. But how program and all that, how they put it all together, and there are pages of calculations, abstract, which I am not able to follow. But I have been emailing Berkovich, and we've been sending each other our papers, and I think he doesn't really understand mine. I certainly don't understand his. And again, we're not passing in the night, strangers passing in the night. We're trying to understand each other, and I don't think he really understands what I'm saying, but we're trying to communicate, and that's good.
Would one of the speakers just comment on, I have gotten to be quite an elderly person and never have heard of Romanes before, and yet I see I know about Darwin, and it looks like Darwin had a better press agent or political power behind him than Romanes ever had. Any comments on the history of, or am I typical of the knowledge of Romanes? And Just comments on how the situation got where Darwin is so well known, and yet Romanes's contributions
Well,
are unknown.
there's a, you know that you have this bell curve, Gaussian distribution, and you have bright people at one limb, and you have Darwin here. But the very bright people, in order to get a publisher's ear, have to communicate with someone. The publishers are, sorry if there are publishers here, are in the middle of the Gaussian curve. They have to communicate, say, publish my book. And the publisher goes to someone who they can communicate with. And the publisher here probably went to Huxley. So you have a chain. You have the Darwin at one side of the curve communicating a little bit to someone who's not quite as bright as Darwin, to Huxley. And Huxley is able to communicate to the publisher. And so there's a chain which can allow Darwin to, and of course it was in Huxley's interest, because he could understand Darwin enough to be able to communicate it effectively. And so it was obviously a very important issue, and the roller got going, and a lot of people jumped on the bandwagon. And it's very interesting to read, going back to evolution, Romanes in 86 wrote a wonderful paper on evolution, setting out this theory. You can open the journal, and the Romanes is the last paper in the journal, and there are all these articles by the people in the middle who are studying Darwin, showing how a species evolved, and whether frogs evolved before newts, or whether newts evolved after frogs, and all arguing these. They were concerned with following Darwin's ideas and showing the paths of evolution, that birds came before elephants and so on, and this sort of thing. They were really minor, trivial problems in the scheme of things. But in Romanes, suddenly there's the last paper. Suddenly you come across Romanes' paper. He's thinking entirely differently, in an entirely different new way. And so there's a big, broad mass of people who are on the bandwagon, and they're the people who really move the science forward, and they often get missed out. My hero happens to be Samuel Butler, who, strange to say, was ahead not only of Darwin, but also of Romanes. And I'm slowly trying to get his ideas brought back into the... he had wonderful ideas about mind, and I mentioned him briefly in the early part of the talk.
And as far as the poetry in that part, there was a huge age gap between Darwin and Romanes. I think from reading the poems, what I can get out of this is that one of the reasons Romanes anguished so much over his death was it was like he was losing his father. It was his mentor, his father. He was very close to him, and when he died, it was horrible. And he died early. And also a lot of the poetry and thing, the papers have been lost. I mean, when David came across this typescript, none of the heirs knew it existed. Lots of the papers are, they don't even know what happened to them. In fact, we were talking about this, they kept, every once in a while something will pop up at a bookseller somewhere, and there's no tracking. Like David couldn't figure out where this typescript, the history of who had it before Henry Southerns, where it had come from. So it had been lost for years and years. So a lot of it's just buried and not around.
I can back up what you're saying, though. Today, in science, you do your degree, and then you do a master's degree, and then you do a PhD. And basically, I think during the PhD, you apprentice yourself to a senior scientist, and this can go on for 2, 3, several years. And virtually, there you're another parent. You have your natural parent, and you have your academic parent, and a very strong relationship develops between the student and every day the two of you are talking, and he or she knows far more than you do, and they guide you into a new academic world. So you can develop a very deep relationship. And when that person happens to be Darwin, then clearly one can understand why Romanes was so attached.
I think we have time for one more question.
Don, excuse me. I'm not quite sure what your problem with plasticity is. For biologists, usually when we think of brain plasticity, what we're thinking about is that new connections can be made, and they can be made in such a way that if there is brain damage, things can be compensated for. I find that more convincing than to think that something is stored outside the brain. So
do I.
Why is there a problem with, what's your problem with the idea of plasticity? I can't follow you
Well,
there.
there comes a stage when the brain gets smaller and smaller, and you have to get rid of the plasticity argument. And all I'm saying is, right now, if I had to gamble, I'd say somehow, by some miraculous way, that poor person's brain, or that not poor person's brain, the healthy person's brain, had adapted to existing with only 5% of tissue, which is incredible to me. And therefore, I think that we at least ought to admit, we ought to open the doors to other explanations. And that's my message. And one of those explanations is one that perhaps resonates with the people at this conference, which is why I'm bringing it up.
I think we should stop there. We would like to thank both the speakers as well as to the audience. And before we end, just a few announcements. Tomorrow, please remember to bring your name tags, which will serve as your admission tickets back into the symposium. And you're welcome to join us for a continental breakfast tomorrow at 8:30 in the foyer right outside here. Session 2 will begin here in the recital hall promptly at 9 o'clock in the morning. We hope you can enjoy us for dessert in the foyer right now, but our final task is to thank the speakers.